Welcome to Unleash Your True Value, a Breaking Money Silence podcast where professional women flip the script on self-doubt, ditch the discount mindset, and start owning their worth like the rock stars they are. Each episode is packed with real talk, practical tips, and the occasional mic drop to help you charge what you're worth and earn what you truly deserve. So buckle up, grab your coffee, because it's time to unleash your true value and make some noise while you're at it. Now, here's your host, Kathleen Kingsbury.
I am so excited today to have my guest, Josie Cox, on the Unleash Your True Value podcast. Let me tell you a little bit about her, do an introduction, and then we'll get right into the conversation. So Josie Cox is the author of Women, Money, Power, The Rise and Fall of Economic Equality. And so I have the book right here. I love this book, but let me tell you a little bit about her first. In addition to being the author of this book, she's a journalist, a broadcaster, a public speaker. She's also an associate instructor at the Columbia School of Professional Studies, and she has been a freelance journalist for Reuters, The Independent, The Wall Street Journal. Oh, no, wait, you worked at those locations.
I did. I was on staff there.
Thank you. So staff member, even more impressive. Reuters, The Independent, Wall Street Journal. She's written as a freelancer for many different well-known publications, including Bloomberg and The Washington Post. She also has been on TV like CNN, ABC, and she still decided to stop by my little podcast, which I really appreciate. One of the things I want to make sure I mention, and she'll explain it a little bit later, but Josie is the founding editor of The Persistent. So that's something to stay tuned and learn more about. So Josie, first of all, welcome to the podcast. It's so exciting to have you here today and to have this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. So I first discovered your work when I was attending a webinar that was put on soon after the US election. So it was like the second week in November. And I remember feeling like your book was such an important piece of work, given the context of what's going on around women and power and money. And so I got the book and I started reading it, and I absolutely loved the stories and the way in which it gave a sense of history and the ups and downs that women have gone through who are working to try to achieve gender equality. So first of all, thank you very much for writing a book that inspired me at a time that I wasn't very inspired.
Well, thank you for reading it.
Yes. And so I was so excited when you agreed to come on the podcast to really talk about the book, but also talk about the work that you do, because my sense is it's really, really important, and especially important now. So let's just start with the book. Like, why did you decide to write this book? What inspired you?
Sure. Yeah. No, thank you for that opening question. So I feel like in order to really understand the kind of origin story of the book, I do need to go back a little bit further. Now, you might have heard from my accent that I am not from the US.
Yes.
I was actually born and raised in Europe. I was born and raised in Switzerland in a tiny little village way out in the countryside by my mom and dad. My mom is Eastern European, originally from Czechoslovakia. My dad's from the north of England. So a very kind of mishmash multicultural family in the middle of nowhere in Switzerland. I like to call it a cultural hinterland because, you know, everything that's happening here today seems to happen there in 20 years' time. So that's the kind of background. I was born and raised there. I ended up going to college in the UK just to kind of explore my heritage, my dad's side of the family. And I realized when I was at college that really the only job that appealed to me was one in which I could have conversations with people and learn their stories and tell stories. Because ultimately, you know, I think a lot of people sort of intuitively know this, but perhaps not consciously know it. The most exciting thing in the world is humans, right? That's why we connect. We love stories. We love gossip. We love true crime. We love anything that kind of involves the intricacies of the human identity and the human mind. And that's something that I really became aware of at university. I was studying politics and modern languages, but I knew pretty quickly that journalism was kind of the route that I wanted to explore. I graduated straight into the financial crisis of
Oh,
2008, 2009, which
yep.
was a wonderful time to graduate, as you can imagine. But I did have this kind of superpower of having been raised speaking German. So I was raised in a dual language household, German English, and speaking German just gave me that edge in the almost non-existent job market right after the financial crisis. And I was lucky enough to get offered a junior reporter position covering financial markets in Frankfurt, which was kind of like the epicenter of the
Hmm.
financial crisis at that time. Now, one thing you should know about me is that I am not a math person. I do not do numbers. I had never studied math. I had never studied markets or finance or statistics or anything kind of related to that when I started this job. But they just needed somebody there who could speak the language, who could, interview people and tell those stories. And so I moved out to Frankfurt. I got myself subscriptions to the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and the Economist and, an armful of Michael Lewis books because
Yes.
they were very good at that time to help me understand what a bond was. And I started covering financial markets. And it was not my passion, but it was a job and it paid a good salary and I was independently earning. And that was more than a lot of people could say who had graduated from college at the same time I had. And I learned an awful lot during that time. Of course I did. It was a very steep learning curve. I could either sink or swim. But one thing that I also learned that really stuck with me and that I keep coming back to is that the world of money, the world of finance is a gendered world.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
it sounds so obvious now, but it really struck me when I started reporting on financial markets that all the people who were willing to speak to why, the euro was up or the dollar was down or the stock index was up, all of them were men and predominantly white men at that. And it kind of baffled me. And it's something that I tried to correct in my reporting. I made a concerted effort pretty early on to try and get as many women on the record to interview as I did men, which was obviously not easy, just purely because of the demographic makeup of the market. But that kind of planted this seed for me. And I knew from that point on, even as, a very young kind of whippersnapper reporter, that this was something that I really wanted to concentrate on throughout my career. Fast forward a little bit, I ended up moving to London. I worked on markets for a little bit longer. I got a job at the Wall Street Journal. I then became business editor at The Independent in the UK at a time that was pretty formative, actually, in terms of this topic. So it was a time when gender pay gap reporting was being mandated by the government in the UK. And that was really interesting because we all knew about the gender pay gap. We were all talking about the gender pay gap, but kind of overnight, companies had to start publishing their gender pay gaps. So it was like black on white evidence that these things existed. And, also like the distribution of them, the fact that gender pay gaps tend to be fairly small in the lowest quartile of pay in an organization. And then they tend to get bigger the higher up the organization you go. And so I was fortunate enough to be managing a desk at a national publication at that time. So really was able to tailor our reporting and focus it on this topic in pretty extensive detail. And then something happened that changed everything, which was I became pregnant. I had my
Ah,
daughter.
yes, a daughter, of
A
course. Yep.
daughter, yep. So this was almost 7 years ago now. And, having studied the gender pay gap and power and money and gender in markets and in the economy more broadly, I knew that the inflection point in people's lives tended to be when they had a kid. That was the time when this push-pull between paid labor and unpaid labor became the most intense, and when we had to start, everyone tends to need to start balancing professional duties and personal duties in a more kind of complicated way. And somehow I thought that I would be immune to all this, right?
Of
Somehow
course,
I
that's
thought,
the beauty of being
of
young.
course,
Yeah.
of course, the naivety, my goodness. Anyway, I had my daughter and I very quickly realized that I squarely fell into this data point of, mothers in the labor market who,
Mm.
for whatever reason, found themselves in a position where they were taking a step out of the paid labor market in order to do unpaid labor, i.e. to care for a family and to raise a family. And it just got me thinking that, nobody can dodge this. It is such a strong force because of cultural norms, because of the sort of individual idiosyncrasies of the economy, because of everything. And so that was really the point where I knew I wanted to delve deeper into this topic and almost do kind of like an anatomy of the gender pay gap. Why does the gender pay gap still exist? In the US, on average, women still make about 82 cents on the dollar that a man makes. And it hasn't really budged in the last 20 years. And so in 2020, my family relocated to the US. I started working in New York. I realized that all of the kind of metrics of inequality that I had observed in Europe very much applied here too, with perhaps an even more kind of powerful overlay of race as well. So that intersectionality being really important. And I was freelancing. I had the opportunity to do a fellowship at grad school, which I never thought I would do. So I took a sort of a step out of the hustle and bustle of freelance life for a year. And during that time, I really set myself this mission of getting this book on the road and getting it rolling. And then I know I'm giving you a ridiculously long answer to your first question.
That's okay.
I'll wrap this up. But there was this one moment that I just wanted to tell you about that you read, if you read the book. For those people listening who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, in the prologue, I described this experience that I had. And it's around February of 2021. So about a year into the COVID-19 pandemic, a time when, women were picking up the vast majority of childcare, of the added burden of school closures and childcare closures and all of that. And I had this amazing opportunity to interview a Fortune 500 CEO. And this man is extremely prominent, very well known, powerful, smart, just a brilliant businessman. And I asked him why he believes the gender pay gap still exists. And you'll recall this, I can see.
Yes, I do. Yep.
And he said, well, one thing that I had to understand is that sometimes when a woman temporarily takes a step out of the paid labor market to have a baby, to care for a child, when she comes back, she's just not as professionally ambitious as she was.
Such a myth.
Such a myth. And I wish I had the poise of your response just there at that moment. But I was quite frankly furious and upset that this is still kind of such a pervasive misunderstanding about why the gender pay gap exists, and that it really has something to do with women's choice, right, in the way that he implied. And so that night I went home, I wrote the prologue of the book, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, I love that he inspired you. I'm sorry that he made you infuriated, but obviously you're passionate about the topic, and the book is so needed. Your timing is really good.
Thank you.
And, one of the things that strikes me about your story is that somehow you were raised with the money message where it was a surprise that the financial world was gendered. So what money messages did you grow up with that you think allowed you to kind of, in a nice way, be in that little bubble that ultimately got burst when you got into the workforce?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And honestly, it's something that I probably should reflect on more because, as you say, it is so formative and it's kind of the foundation of all my thinking. So to speak a little bit more to my background and the way that I grew up, both my parents worked. I never recall a time when my mom did not work. I do know that she was the primary caregiver. So she was the one who stayed home when my sister and I were sick. She was the one who, I was going to say she picked us up from school, but she didn't actually. We had a neighbor who picked us up from school. We lived in this little tiny village that was very idyllic, and even, at a young age, we would walk to school ourselves and we would walk home ourselves, and it had like 400 people.
I have to just get this out because I love Switzerland and I'm a big skier. So part of me is like, did you ski home? Did you ski to school?
We didn't quite ski to school, but I do. I recall a few times sledding to school because it was down the hill.
Nice.
So,
nice.
Yeah. But the most relevant thing in response to your question is that my mom and dad were both breadwinners. They both worked. And so I think that created this real impression of normalcy in my mind. And, I think that I did have a lot of friends whose mothers did not work, but fundamentally the message that was instilled in me as I was growing up was that women can do what men do. And I think that was really important. Yeah. And then basically the older I got and the more exposed I became to the real world, the more I realized that actually the balance of financial power is still very much out of whack. And that kind of, as I say, kind of culminated when I began covering this topic of what I call big money, right, which is investments and finance and all these media through which power flows around the world, I suppose. Yeah, so it was sort of like an unraveling, I suppose. right?
Well, and what's interesting about that, or what I identify, is I grew up in a similar home,
Mhm,
graduated a little bit before you, but
mhm,
mom and dad worked as a team.
mhm,
And my father, well before it was, commonplace, would often be the one who takes us to the pediatrician as
right.
opposed to mom. So, they shared responsibilities. I do remember them because I was kind of financially geeky back then, remember them having financial conversations and
Uh-huh.
balancing the checkbook and that kind of thing. But I was raised with the same belief, like women, and I have a sister, like women can do anything that men can do. And then
Mhm,
all of a sudden you're out in the real world. And for me, it was late 80s, early 90s. And it
mhm.
was like, whoa, wait a
Yeah.
second. What I
Mhm.
learned at home isn't necessarily true.
Yeah.
Um, and so you had kind of the same aha.
Yeah.
We both attacked it in very different ways in terms of the work that we do.
Mhm.
But I'm wondering, because for me, I actually struggled early on in my career to really understand my value. Like, I don't think I consciously took the message and said, oh, women aren't worth as much,
Mhm.
but somehow it really shook my confidence.
Mm.
And so I'm wondering, did you have a similar experience around understanding your value as you were negotiating?
Mm.
Or were you the exception to the rule where it was like, no, I was brought up a certain way and mom and dad worked, and therefore I was able to stand in my true value all along?
No, I don't think so. The last thing, by the way, I would say in response to your first question is that it just occurred to me that a lot of people don't know this, but Switzerland is very backwards in terms of this topic.
Oh,
And so it's
really? I would have thought
extra
more neutral.
no, neutral on everything else.
Yeah. Mhm.
But in terms of kind of political equality and economic equality, it's very, very far behind. So much so that actually they have cantons rather than states. So the
Mhm.
regional, areas are called cantons. One canton in Switzerland didn't give women the right to vote until 1991.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay. So this was the backdrop against which my mother was working and,
Yes.
assuming. Anyway, but to your point, to your next question, rather, I think I graduated into such a weird market. It was the financial crisis. There were no jobs going. I had this very specialized skill set, i.e., I spoke German and I wanted to become a journalist and I was a decent writer. So that fortunately led me to a position where I was offered a job that it was well paid. It was very well paid.
It's
I
great.
didn't know how much I didn't know what to do with all this money that I suddenly had. This was I like waited on people and like
Yeah.
done college jobs, but I'd never had a career job before, right? And so that might have sort of skewed my view on the labor market and how easy it is to actually get a job where you feel like you're being compensated fairly. Subsequently, when I moved jobs, when I moved to London, when I started working in different places and in different companies, I did start to come up against situations where I felt like my gender was something that was holding me back. And I think particularly at a certain age, I got married in my late 20s, mid to late 20s, and I started a new job around then. And I do believe that I was perhaps not offered the same amount of money as if they had. I'm being very careful how I'm saying this,
It's okay.
as if they had not, entertained the idea that I might be taking a maternity leave at some point very soon, right?
Yeah. So to fit with almost what that
Mhm.
CEO said,
Complete,
you started to live it.
totally, absolutely. And that was also what I was hearing from other women, peers in the market. And then the other thing that was coming into the equation and that was sort of coming into our consciousness was, there was a lot of talk at that time around things like imposter syndrome,
Mhm.
right? And I firmly believe that we are not doing ourselves any favors if we are perpetuating this myth that
Yeah.
women suffer from imposter syndrome. It's sort of like we're giving ourselves a crutch, we're giving ourselves an excuse to be apologetic, to hold
Mhm.
ourselves back, to perhaps not be as confident and as assertive and as proud of our own ambition and our own skill as we should be.
Well, I think it's really weaponized,
Oh yeah.
and it happens to men too, but a lot of women don't know that it happens to men too.
Mhm,
And, my background is both in finance as well as
mhm,
psychology. So I've clinically worked with people who have struggled with self-esteem issues and, not feeling like they're worthy at a variety of different levels. So I feel like it happens, but I do feel like it's weaponized. I
Yeah.
also, the same philosophy around women aren't good negotiators. If I hear that one more time, we're great negotiators. We may not have been trained. We may not have a society that reinforces it's okay if we're profit motivated and we negotiate on our behalf. But yes, I think there is a way in which it does us a disservice to kind of almost diagnose us with, oh, we're imposters. We don't
Oh, for
really know
sure.
how to do this. Poor little women, which is
Yeah.
not the case. And
Right.
especially when you read your book, you're like, women have rocked for decades, centuries,
Mhm.
and discovering some of the women that we know and their stories. And then also some of the women that you uncovered that we don't know about, that we should know about. It was really
Mhm.
fascinating.
Yeah.
But I would agree that it's kind of a mixed message in our society for women.
Totally. Yeah. There was some research out last year, actually. I don't know if you're familiar with this, looking at the extent to which female MBA graduates negotiate starting salaries.
Hmm.
And it actually showed that there was a significant premium, like that women negotiated harder than men,
Hmm.
actually. So flipping that perception upside down.
Yeah,
Um,
flipping the script because I
yeah.
think more and more, especially younger generation than me, have seen mothers
Mhm.
who have not done that and
Right.
been coached.
Completely.
And my hope is there's more training and things like that out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it sounds like you hit up against it, but you didn't really question your value. You just kind of were like, I hit up against this thing.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't question my value. I think I challenged what I was seeing. And I
Yeah.
think I did that in a number of ways. I've always been comfortable advocating for more pay in the workplace if I feel like I deserve it. I
Which is
remember
great.
very early on, I was on a particular contract with a particular term or a nuance or a condition or something, which meant that I didn't get this like $500 bonus that my colleague got. And I remember not letting it go and calling my manager into a room every single week and being like, so where are we at? Where are we at? And I got it in the end. Of course, $500, it's probably not going to change your life, right?
It's
But
the principle of the thing.
it's the principle. Really. No, it is. And I firmly believe that. I think that money is a gauge of power, but it is also a sign of respect. And a lot of the time when I'm telling people to advocate for themselves financially and economically, it is because I want them to understand that they're worth it, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Um,
No,
yeah,
absolutely. And
yeah,
so is that kind of why you wrote the book? Like
yeah.
what do you hope is the outcome of people reading the book?
Yeah, well, sort of picking up on the story about the interview with this CEO, and every time I mention him, by the way, I'm terrified I'm going to say his name, so
It's
that's
okay.
fine.
I'm not going to pressure you. I'm
Um,
dying to know, but I'm not going to
I
ask.
know,
Yes.
I know. So, yeah, so after that interview, I immediately felt this sense of duty. I do believe that as a journalist, we do have a sense of duty to inform, to raise awareness, to dismantle myths in this case. And so, I very much kind of felt that this was a call to action. And I had obviously been wanting to write a book about this, but that was really the sign for me that I had a role to play in kind of lifting the lid on the gender pay gap and on these misconceptions around why it exists. And yeah, I decided that the best way to do that was to go back through history. You and I were chatting just before we came on air, and I said, I'm not an economist, I'm not a historian, but I'm a storyteller, and so I very much knew that that was the means by which I wanted to write this book. I wanted it to be packed full of stories of real people, relatable women, individuals who did remarkable things, who either we've heard of tangentially, or we kind of know roughly who they are, or who are complete unknowns, but really shed a light on their stories and their lives and their achievements in order to inspire hope and optimism, and also to encourage women from whatever background to feel comfortable questioning and advocating and challenging if something doesn't feel right. And that might be something on a personal level. It might be that you're getting paid 20% less than the person who sits next to you, who's doing the same job as you. It also might be more systemic, right? It might mean marching down the street because you're not happy with the election outcome, right?
Yep.
And so I just really hope that this book gives people that inspiration, but also that license to stand, it sounds cliched, but kind of to stand in their power, right? And to realize that and to not be ashamed of that.
Well, and I think that that's your superpower. So, one of the things in any of the coaching that I do with women, it's all about unleashing your true value. And your true
Mhm.
value, there's knowledge, there's skills, but there's also who you authentically are and your
Mhm.
superpowers. And the fact that you always have been pretty good at pushing back.
Mhm.
And what a great way to respond to a situation that was uncomfortable and
Mm.
upsetting, to say, you know what, I'm going to encourage other women and I'm going to push back
Yeah.
and act out, I think, in a good way, like a healthy
Yeah.
way. It's a
Yeah.
healthy way of acting out.
Yeah. And the
Um,
other thing I would say about that as well is that, I think there's a time and place for confrontation. I really do. I think sometimes you need to be angry and you need to show that anger and that needs to come out. At other times, I think we underappreciate the power of a good conversation, of a dialogue that is rooted in respect and that is rooted in understanding and that is also based on listening, right? And, a lot of people have said to me, what would you say to this gentleman if you had the opportunity to sit down with him now? You know, in many ways, that initial rage and the fury that I felt when he gave that as a response has sort of been replaced by sadness and almost pity that for
mm,
so long he actually thought that that was the most appropriate answer to give or the most correct answer to give. And I do think that we need to become more empathetic and better listeners, and we need to make more of an effort to kind of bridge those gaps in understanding, in perspective. And so I also, I there's a chapter in the book where I really go deep on this and talk about it in reference to things like the conversations around abortion that we're having in this country. How do you engage with someone to the extent that you can help them to see your perspective, right?
mhm.
And I think that that applies to politics, that applies to healthcare, that applies to money.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one, and certainly in the context of what the world is,
Hmm.
at least in the US,
Right.
although it's globally, I think currently it's really important to have those conversations. And I often say to people, especially when they're breaking money silence around money, I
Yeah.
say the goal isn't to convince somebody of your position
Mhm.
necessarily. You start with trying to understand, like mutual understanding. Help me understand why you think
Right.
that a woman, you know, as a mother is less valuable than a woman before
Right.
she's a mother or if she chooses not to be a mother.
Yeah.
And so to try to have that mutual understanding.
Yes.
I do think your book, at least sample size number one, that's me, did have that impact in terms of really thinking through how to use the history and how to have hope and to
Mhm.
see again those ups and downs and know that, okay, we've been down before, but the beauty of women, especially women in community, is we do get back up. We don't
Yeah.
stay down for very
Mhm.
long.
Mhm.
I want to ask you a series of questions that I just ask everybody that comes
Okay.
on the Unleash Your True Value podcast. And so I'm just going to change gears really quickly, and quick answers are fine.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, Josie, what's the craziest thing you've ever done to land a client, a job, an interview that you can share on a
Oh
podcast?
man. I think just an awful lot of networking.
That's
Yeah.
the craziest thing you've done?
I know I'm not particularly crazy. What can I say? And I wish I had a more the creative and wacky answer for
That's
you.
okay.
But just meeting, just going along to things that you just wouldn't usually want to go along to, exposing yourself to people who you don't think are going to necessarily lead to work, but you never know, right? There are all kinds of strange situations where you might meet people who are accretive to what you're doing, who
Yeah,
can lead you to an amazing opportunity.
I love that. I love that. I'm a big
Conversations with
networker.
strangers, right?
It
Yeah.
doesn't it's fine that it's not crazy, I'm just
No.
curious.
Yeah.
Uh, but is that it may be similar to what you just said, but what's one tip you would give somebody listening in, whether she is, identifies as a woman or a male ally trying to support women?
Yeah.
What tip would you offer?
In terms of getting them
Um,
professional advancement, or what are we specifically talking
let
about?
Thank you, journalist, for your follow-up answer.
Sorry about
Let's No, it's okay, that's helpful. I love curiosity. So, one tip around how to unleash your true value or how to
okay.
stand in your
Yeah.
power, to use your words.
Yeah. I think to the extent that it's possible, experimentation, you know?
Ooh, say a little bit more.
Yeah. I think you never truly know where your true value lies until you've tried it. And that can sound terrifying. I got into TV work at a time when I was terrified of being on TV, and my stomach would sink every time someone even said the word TV. But actually, I ended up really enjoying it, and it was wonderful for my professional profile. Similarly, and this is a more recent example, I recorded the audiobook of my book.
Oh, nice.
And I never thought that would be something that I would enjoy or that would give me, value, however you define value. But I loved it. I've been nominated for a few audiobook awards, which I'm thrilled with.
I didn't know that. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you. And it's opened up this whole avenue of potential work for me that I never thought I would be interested in, or even that would even be accessible to me. And so I think, we sort of lose that experimentation, that playfulness as we become more solidified in our comfort zone. And I would just really encourage people to, I was about to say think outside the box, but I'm not going to use that cliche. Just encourage people to give themselves more credit for things that aren't necessarily their areas of expertise, whatever that means.
Well, so network, experiment. If you can finish this sentence, and I don't have any preconceived notion as to how it applies. So dare to be
bold.
Awesome. Awesome. It is such an honor and joy to chat with you. You are as lovely as I thought you would be. And you really, as I look at the work that I've done, primarily in the wealth management field, but around women in wealth and in a previous life, clinically empowering women to feel better about their bodies, I just feel like you are like that next generation and doing it on such a wide platform that it does make me hopeful that the 40 years of my career have been worth it, and in some ways passing on and knowing that all this good work is going to continue. So I really do appreciate, Josie, all the work, the book, the other stuff you're doing. I want people to learn a little bit more about where they can find the book, where they can connect with you. And also we did a little teaser at the beginning about the persistent. So share those pieces of information.
Great. So very quickly, the book is available wherever you get good books, hopefully your local bookstore. It is available as an audiobook, as an ebook, and as a hardcover. I'd be delighted if you did choose to read it, of course. I am writing for many outlets at the moment, but very excitingly, I'm working on a new project, as you alluded to, called The Persistent. It is a platform that is designed to elevate and amplify women's voices. The idea being that mainstream media has traditionally not given marginalized voices the platforms they deserve. And so I'm working with a phenomenal editor, Francesca Donna, who is formerly of the New York Times, formerly of the Wall Street Journal as well. And her and I have been working on this for about a year now. It's a twice weekly newsletter at the moment. You can subscribe at thepersistent.com. I write frequently. It is all free as well at the moment. So please do sign up and let us know what you think. And then aside from that, I'm on all the regular social media platforms. I'm on Blue Sky, which is the new big thing.
Yeah.
So you can follow all my work on there. And I always love hearing from people. I love engaging in interesting conversations, being challenged, and hearing from like-minded people too.
Excellent. Well, it has been such an honor to break money silence with you and to learn more about you as a person, you as an author and a journalist. And I know that my audience will really benefit. And I know once I end this podcast, I'm signing up for The Persistent. So thank you so much for your time today, Josie.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Unleash Your True Value. I hope you're feeling inspired, empowered, and ready to own your worth unapologetically. Remember, your value isn't up for negotiation. It's time to embrace it, amplify it, and let the world know exactly what you bring to the table. If you're ready to take things even further, you don't have to do it alone. As a money mindset and business coach, Kathleen specializes in helping professional women like you rewrite their money stories, step fully into their power, and take their businesses to the next level. Visit kbkwealthconnection.com to set up a free coaching discovery call. Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe, share this episode with someone who needs to hear it, and leave us a 5-star review. Until next time, ditch that discount mindset and unleash your true value like the rock star you are.